The biggest turning points in life don't happen in courtrooms or under bright stage lights. They happen in silence, often right at your own front door. That's where I felt the cruelest pain of all, being left waiting by my own son. It wasn't just being late, it was disregard, it was betrayal, and I stood there with the cold wind cutting my face, feeling every minute turn into humiliation. But here's what most people don't understand. It's in moments like these that life hands you the most unexpected weapons. While he thought I was just an old man fading into the background, I was quietly holding something that could change everything. He believed he had all the control, but he didn't know I still had the key to the entire story. What began as abandonment at that doorstep became a silent plan for justice. Today, I'll show you how the sting of rejection can spark true liberation, and how even in silence, you can prepare the most powerful revenge. That night, I adjusted my hat the way a man adjusts a piece of his own soul. Sounds dramatic maybe, but when you reach my age, 66, shoulders heavy with memories and responsibilities, every little thing becomes a symbol. That hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a companion, a reminder of all those years walking out of my woodshop, covered in sawdust, proud that my hard work was putting food on the table. But that night, there was no sawdust, no tools, just the heavy weight of waiting. I was ready for the dinner Daniel, my son, had promised. He said he'd come pick me up, and I believed him, because a father always wants to believe. But when hope stretches past what's reasonable, it turns into something else, into pain. The wind turned sharper. At first, I brushed it off. I pulled my coat tighter and told myself, he's probably on his way. Funny how we create excuses for the people we love. I'd done it countless times before. I remembered when Daniel was a boy and we'd planned to go to the park after I closed the shop. Sometimes I'd run late because a customer wanted just one more adjustment, and there he'd be, standing on the sidewalk with his ball under his arm, waiting. The difference was, back then, I'd come running, apologizing, because I couldn't bear to see disappointment in his eyes. Now the roles had reversed. I was the one waiting, and he was the one not coming. Each minute that passed piled more humiliation onto the cold night air. I checked my watch so many times it felt like the hands were mocking me. The ticking wasn't just sound, it was a cruel whisper. He's not coming, Edward. Have you ever gone through that? Standing there, waiting for someone who promised to show up but never did. It's not just the delay that hurts, it's what it means. It's like they're saying, without words, that you're not a priority. That happens in marriages, friendships, families, and it always leaves scars. I'd told plenty of others before. When someone shows you over and over that your time doesn't matter, it's because you don't matter to them. Easy to say in theory, but when it's your own flesh and blood, the wound cuts much deeper. I tried to keep my head high. Dignity isn't just a fancy word, it's a state of being. But the cruelty of that night was this. Every car that passed gave me a flicker of hope, and every pair of headlights that faded around the corner ripped another piece out of my chest. You ever notice that? The sound of an engine can be comforting for 3 seconds, and then the harshest confirmation that it wasn't who you were waiting for. That roller coaster of emotions drains you dry. It's like life is laughing at your foolishness, reminding you that the deepest betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the ones who should have shown you respect and care. Still, I stayed there. A voice inside told me, "Go inside, Edward. Don't subject yourself to this." But another more stubborn voice pushed me to wait just 5 more minutes. And those 5 minutes multiplied. Just like when someone swears they'll change, and you choose to believe one more time, against all the evidence. You've seen this before, haven't you? People staying in miserable marriages or toxic families because they're clinging to the hope that next time will be different. I've seen it too many times. Women enduring humiliation thinking their husband will one day be who he used to be. Parents swallowing insults, waiting for their kids to finally grow up. The cycle is always the same: hope, disappointment, then a desperate search for even a scrap of respect. As I waited, a memory came rushing back. The day I bought the very house I live in now. I had worked double shifts for months, gave up rest, gave up any chance of leisure, just to put a solid roof over my family's head. That door I leaned against. How many times had Daniel come running through it, smiling, bright-eyed after school? The contrast was brutal. The same place that once held joy had now turned into the stage for silence and loneliness. That's the cruel paradox of life. What once fills us with pride can later become the backdrop of our deepest humiliation. So I stood there, like a guard posted at the gates of my own pain. The cold wasn't just on my skin anymore. It had sunk into my soul. Deep down, I knew this wasn't random. This wasn't a delay. It was a decision. Daniel wasn't just running late. He wasn't coming at all. And when that truth finally landed, my dignity, something I had always valued, began to mix with something else. a quiet rage, the kind that would later become revenge, because every betrayal has consequences, and every silence hides a secret waiting to be revealed. That night didn't end with the family dinner I'd been promised. It ended with a bitter realization that the waiting outside my own door was only the prologue to something far greater. I didn't know it yet, but that cold night was just the beginning. The emptiness I felt standing there was simply, preparing the ground for wounds far deeper. I was still standing at that door, but the waiting had changed. Time has a cruel way of turning minutes into invisible knives. Every glance at my watch felt like another cut, my patience rotting away like old wood in the rain. The silence of the street wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a screaming loneliness echoing inside me. There was no room left for excuses. What remained was emptiness. And no matter how hard I tried to mask it, that emptiness was humiliation itself. Every passing second, a silent accusation against my worth in the eyes of my own son. Watching the clock had become a painful ritual. You know how time slows when you're waiting? You stare at it, hoping maybe one more minute will bring the solution. But all it proves is that time doesn't care about your desperation. I remembered when I was young, waiting for customers who promised to come pick up furniture I had built. Some came, others never did. Back then, if someone stood me up, I shrugged it off. It's just business. But this was different. This wasn't a client. This was blood of my blood. And when your own family leaves you standing in the dark, it isn't just wasted time. It's dignity crumbling, respect slipping away. It was exactly at that moment that I heard the voice of Mrs. Brown, my neighbor. She had always been the talkative type, the kind who knows everything happening on the block. From her porch, she called out, "Did Daniel forget you, again?" The question sounded innocent, maybe even compassionate, but it hit me like an arrow. Because when the wound is already open, any word becomes salt. I forced a smile, trying to hide the pain, but inside I felt exposed, as if my private life had turned into entertainment for the neighborhood. It wasn't just my son forgetting me, it was public humiliation, even if unspoken. And that's one of the hardest things, when family, who should protect you, becomes the very source of shame. Her words echoed in my mind. Again, that single word revealed an uncomfortable truth. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. The betrayal hadn't started that night. It had been dripping slowly, little by little, until it became unbearable. Like water wearing down stone, it doesn't shatter right away, but it eats away over time. That's what neglect in a family feels like. A forgotten moment here, an absence there, until one day you realize you no longer have a place at all. And that realization cuts deep, because it forces you to admit something you don't want to face. The people you love no longer respect you the same way. I started thinking about how many others live through the same thing. How many fathers are forgotten on birthdays, ignored during holidays, left out of family gatherings. How many mothers spend hours preparing a dinner table only to receive a hollow excuse by text. Everyday betrayal doesn't need shouting or insults. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in absence, in indifference disguised as being busy. I've told friends this before. The greatest enemy of family bonds isn't anger, it's being forgotten. Because anger still shows emotion. Forgetting shows you don't matter. That coldness kills, slowly. Little by little, I felt the loneliness wasn't just on the street. It was inside me, my head filled with memories. The noisy Christmases when Daniel, still a boy, ran around the tree. The nights I came home exhausted from the shop, only for him to hug me tight and say, "Dad, you're my hero." Where did that boy go? When did he stop seeing the dignity in my hard work and start treating me like a burden? Those questions had no answer, but they ate at me. The emptiness at the door was only a reflection of the emptiness growing between us, and that abyss scared me more than the cold ever could. When I looked back toward the street, I realized there was no hope left of him showing up. The silence, once just uncomfortable, now felt deafening. It was as if life itself whispered, "Edward, it's time to wake up." And waking up hurts, because when you finally accept that you've been forgotten, when you realize it was deliberate, some part of your innocence dies. I stepped back inside, but I didn't carry just my body. I carried in a heavy heart, a wounded spirit, and the certainty that this night would mark a turning point. I didn't know it yet, but social media was about to show me the truth in an even crueler way. I walked inside with heavy shoulders, as if the cold wind had stuck to me. I set my hat on the table and sank into the armchair, too drained to turn on the TV or open a book. The silence mocked my patience now. I grabbed the phone and, clinging to hope, dialed Daniel's number. Once, twice, 3 times. The same answer. Voicemail. Each attempt felt like a door slammed in my face. Have you ever felt that? Calling someone over and over, knowing full well they chose not to pick up? That's the difference between an accident and a betrayal. An accident comes with an excuse. Betrayal comes with calculated silence. Still, I kept trying, because a father's heart is stubborn. I told myself, he must be busy. Maybe his phone died. The mind invents excuses when it can't handle the truth. But the truth always finds its way out. Without even thinking, I opened social media. I just wanted a distraction, but what I found was the last thing I wanted to see. It only took one scroll. A picture lit up my screen, and it screamed at me. There was Daniel, smiling, seated at the table of a fancy restaurant. Next to him was Laura, my daughter-in-law, holding a glass of wine. Across from them, my grandkids, plates full, laughing, and the caption read, "Family dinner, nothing better." That sentence hit me like a hammer. Family dinner, and yet I wasn't there. Do you see the irony? While I stood freezing at my door, waiting for the car that never came, they were celebrating, toasting, laughing. The betrayal wasn't only in their absence, it was in the replacement, as if they had erased my name from the guest list, as if I was some stranger unworthy of a seat at the table. And that kind of wound can't be explained with words. Because when someone you love excludes you from what should be shared, the humiliation isn't just social, it's intimate, it's personal. It's like hearing, "You don't belong to this family anymore." What cut me the deepest wasn't the food, or the wine, or the fancy restaurant. It was the joy on their faces, as if nothing was wrong. It's like someone stomping on your dignity and smiling while doing it, believing there will never be consequences. I thought of all the times I had worked double shifts in the shop to pay Daniel's tuition, to give him the education I never had. While I went without new clothes, he had imported books and the latest technology. I did it because I believed I was investing in the future of the family. And now, being excluded from the very thing I valued most, family, unity, was living proof that even sacrifice can be betrayed. I stared at that picture the way you stare at a broken mirror. Each shard reflected a part of my story. The present father, the provider, the man who believed respect still mattered. But in that distorted mosaic, what I saw was a disposable father. And this happens to more people than you think. How many older parents stare at social media only to realize they weren't invited to their grandchild's birthday? How many parents stumble across vacation photos of their kids together without them? This is betrayal in its new form. It doesn't come by letter or phone call. It comes in posts, in likes, in digital smiles that scream exclusion. And in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't being late. There was no excuse. It was intentional. Daniel had chosen to leave me out. That realization was like a punch to the gut. Because when you finally understand you've been excluded on purpose, humiliation transforms into something else, into a wound. And wounds like that don't heal with painkillers. They demand reflection. They demand a decision. I could have stormed into that restaurant, demanded respect, created a scene. But deep down, I already knew. The most powerful revenge never comes from shouting. It comes from silence, from the quiet preparation of the turnaround. I closed my phone with trembling hands. What had once been hope was now absolute clarity. I no longer had doubts. My son didn't see me as part of that table, of that family I had worked so hard to build. And if his exclusion was intentional, then my next step would have to be intentional too. His betrayal opened the door to an inevitable question. What would I do with everything that was still under my control? I didn't yet know how, but I could feel something had awakened inside me, a silence charged with emotion, ready to turn into action. That night didn't end when I put the phone down. On the contrary, that's when the real torment began. I went to my room, but sleep never came. The darkness around me seemed alive, each shadow whispering questions I didn't want to answer. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I replayed every moment of my life with Daniel. The silence in the house wasn't just the absence of noise, it was an accusation, reminding me that I had been betrayed in the very thing I valued most, family. Some silences comfort you, others scream louder than any argument. I thought of all the years I had worked double shifts at the shop, sometimes until dawn, just to make sure Daniel never went without. I remembered nights when my hands were so sore I could barely hold a fork at dinner. And still, I smiled, because I believed the sacrifice was an investment in a better future for him. It's strange how we accept the humiliation of hard labor, the sweat, the exhaustion, all in the name of love. And yet, lying there in the stillness of that night, I asked myself, where was the respect that should have grown from that sacrifice? The betrayal wasn't just in forgetting me. It was in the ingratitude that had piled up over the years. I rolled back and forth in bed, thinking about how many parents go through the same thing. Men and women who gave everything to their children, only to grow old and be treated as burdens. That is the tragedy of family bonds without gratitude. It's like planting a tree with all your care, watering it for years, and one day being denied a seat in its shade. I once knew an older man in the neighborhood, Mr. Harris, who paid for both his daughters' college degrees. Today they hardly even call him on Christmas. His silence was heavy, just like mine. He told me once, "Edward, we sacrifice to educate, but we forget to teach respect." That sentence echoed in my mind that night, as if it were my own. The silence also forced me to revisit the happier memories. I remember Daniel as a boy, sitting at the workbench in my shop, trying to copy my movements with a chisel. He'd look at me with shining eyes and say, "One day, I'll be just like you, Dad." Back then, I could never have imagined that admiration would one day turn to disdain. But life works that way. Time reveals not only the character of our children, but also the price of the choices we made. Maybe I was wrong to give so much and ask for so little. Maybe by protecting him too much, I allowed him to forget the value of dignity and respect. And the irony was this: that night, the silence was teaching me more than 1,000 words ever could. Finally, I decided to get up. I walked to my office like a man searching for answers in old papers. I opened the desk drawer without expectation, just to occupy my restless mind. Among old bills, forgotten letters, and random notes, I found a folder I hadn't seen in years. Touching those documents felt like finding an old tool in the shop. Ordinary at first glance, but heavy with history. It didn't feel like chance. It felt like life itself was steering me there, to remind me that even in betrayal, there could be a path to liberation. A silent path, but powerful. I stared at that folder for a few minutes before opening it. The midnight silence broke only with the rustle of paper. Inside were documents I had almost forgotten were still valid. Deeds, records, contracts, symbols that, despite the humiliation of the night, I still had dignity and I still had power. In that moment I realized something. Silence can wound, but it can also reveal. Because when you stop listening to everyone else's excuses, you begin to hear the truth buried inside yourself. The emptiness of waiting had led me to a turning point. From here on, nothing would ever be the same. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. No shouting, no confrontation, only silence. But within that silence, a new force was rising, something I had never felt before. The humiliation I had carried was beginning to transform into a seed of revenge. Not the destructive kind, but a quiet revenge built on justice and respect. Because in the end, no betrayal lasts forever. Sooner or later, life gives us the chance to turn the tables. And that night, surrounded by shadows, silence, and forgotten documents, I felt that chance was closer than I could have imagined. When I finally opened the folder, my eyes took a few seconds to believe what they were seeing. Between papers yellowed by time, there it was, the deed to the house, my house, built with my own hands, brick by brick, sweat by sweat. Next to it lay a financial power of attorney, still valid, giving me control over part of the family's assets. That was more than just paper. It was a quiet reminder that despite the betrayal and humiliation I had endured, I still held something Daniel could never have imagined: control. And in that moment, the silence of the night became revelation. I held those documents like a man holding a forgotten key. Have you ever found something you thought was lost and suddenly everything changed? That was exactly the feeling. The same man who just hours earlier had felt rejected and useless now realized he still had a powerful card to play. Life works like that. Sometimes it knocks the ground out from under you, only to reveal hidden tools you can use to rebuild your dignity. And it's not always documents. Sometimes it's a skill, a memory, or even a loyal friend who appears when you least expect it. The point is, no one is ever completely powerless. As I leafed through the papers, memories of my own path came flooding back. I remembered the long nights alone in the shop, surrounded by the hum of machines, working so my family never lacked anything. Every contract signed, every property bought, every financial decision was born out of discipline and respect. I denied myself many pleasures, but I never gave up my dignity. And now, seeing that I still had power over those assets, felt like receiving an unexpected gift from my own past. It was as if the Edward who worked and sacrificed had left a strategic inheritance for the Edward who had just been betrayed. The most curious thing was that Daniel would never suspect it. He thought he had taken control of everything, that I was too old to understand papers, numbers, and signatures. But he was wrong. Youth may bring strength, but it often dismisses the wisdom that only time can give. And it's that wisdom that turns silence into revenge. How many children look at their parents as if they were relics in a museum, forgetting that those very parents were the true architects of the wealth they now enjoy. Daniel had humiliated me, but he didn't know I still held the foundation of it all. That was the sweetest irony of the situation. In that instant, I realized I had a choice. I could keep drowning in self-pity, surrendering to the pain of exclusion, or I could use what I had to win back my respect. And let me be clear, I wasn't talking about petty revenge. I was talking about justice. When someone betrays your trust, silence is the sharpest answer, but only when silence is paired with action, and action requires preparation. As I looked at that power of attorney, one question burned in my mind. If Daniel knew that my signature was still necessary, would he have treated me this way? The answer was obvious. No. And that clarity lit a fire inside me, a flame I thought had long burned out. I've seen many men my age give up. Fathers who swallow humiliation quietly, convinced they no longer matter. But that night, buried in forgotten documents, I found not just power, but liberation. It was as if life itself whispered, "Edward, you are not a victim, you are the protagonist." And that changes everything. Because once you see yourself as the protagonist of your own story, even pain becomes fuel. I didn't need to lash out with words or screams. I could rewrite the story with documents, with signatures, with silent moves that would make Daniel understand, in the harshest way possible, the weight of lost respect. I closed the folder and held it against my chest, like a man clutching an invisible weapon. There were no more tears, only determination. Alone in that office, I understood something. Daniel's betrayal had wounded me, but it had also awakened me. And in that awakening, I found something stronger than anger. I found strategy. Because true revenge is never born from haste. It's born from patience. And I was ready to wait for the right moment. That document wasn't just paper. It was the key to a new path. A path of silent justice that would change everything. I sat back down in my chair, holding that folder like newly discovered treasure. In my hands, I wasn't just holding papers. I was holding years of work, discipline, and vision. It was as if the man I used to be had left a weapon for the man I had become. I had already gone through betrayal, humiliation, the emptiness of waiting. But now, for the first time in years, I felt something different. Clarity. The clarity that I would no longer be a hostage of ingratitude. I decided I would turn that wound into a path of liberation. And deep inside, I knew, revenge doesn't need noise. It only needs precision. At dawn, as the sun poured through the window, I thought about life's ironies. Daniel believed he had reduced me to a spectator, someone who should sit quietly on the sidelines while he enjoyed his comfortable life. But the truth was, I was still part of the central plot. That realization struck like lightning. Because real power isn't about yelling or forcing your will on others. Real power is knowing you hold something in your hands that can flip the game, and choosing the perfect moment to use it. That document reminded me that dignity can also live in calculated silence. And that was when I made my decision. I wouldn't confront Daniel right away. I would move with intelligence. Decision-making is a strange thing. We often think it's just choosing between yes and no. But in reality, deciding means choosing who you want to be from that moment forward. I could have chosen to remain the hurt father, endlessly complaining about the lack of respect, sinking into bitterness. But I chose instead to be the man who stands up from humiliation and turns pain into strategy. That lesson applies to every part of life. How many times have you been betrayed by family, at work, by friends, and stayed stuck, replaying it over and over? Turning the page takes courage, because it's not only about punishing the other person, it's about rescuing your own dignity. With that spirit, I sought out my old lawyer, Mr. Campbell, a discreet man with a calm voice who had stood by me for decades. When I entered his office, he welcomed me with that look that blends respect and curiosity. "Edward, it's been a long time. What brings you here?" I sat down, placed the folder on his desk, and said, "I need to make some changes." He leafed through the documents carefully, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. I could see it in his eyes. He understood. This wasn't just bureaucracy. This was the beginning of something bigger. When life puts certain papers in your hands, sometimes it's handing you the chance to rewrite the story. As we spoke, I remembered a principle I've always carried. Never reveal your strategy in the heat of emotion. That's how great chess players win. They don't move pieces out of anger, but out of calculation. And sitting there with Mr. Campbell, I saw my life as a chessboard. Daniel, without realizing it, had left his king vulnerable, and I, with patience, would move my pieces, one by one. No rush, no noise. That's something I'd tell anyone listening now. Never make life-changing decisions with a hot head. If someone humiliated you, breathe. If someone betrayed you, reflect. Silence is the first step toward a revenge well planned, or, if you prefer a softer word, a justice well delivered. Mr. Campbell, sharp as always, looked at me and asked, "Edward, you have more power in your hands than you think. What do you plan to do with it?" And I replied, "I want to make sure my dignity is respected. I want to show that betrayal has consequences, but without losing my peace." He nodded, and at that moment I felt the weight of my decision take shape. It was no longer a surge of anger. It was a project, a silent revenge, built on solid ground. One that would give me back not just respect, but the freedom I had been searching for. Because in the end, my goal wasn't to destroy Daniel. It was to make him see the value he had so carelessly dismissed. I left the office with the folder tucked under my arm, walking slowly down the sidewalk. The cold wind no longer stung me. It didn't freeze me. It didn't wound me. On the contrary, it felt like it was pushing me forward, as if whispering, "Now it's your turn." And there, in my heart, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: serenity. Because when you truly decide, life begins to arrange itself around your choice. The silence of humiliation gave way to a firm inner voice repeating, "Edward, you haven't lost. You've just begun a new game." The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. My body was still tired, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I put on my old jacket, straightened the same hat that had witnessed my humiliation at the door, and walked toward Mr. Campbell's office. My steps weren't rushed, but firm. Each one was a silent reminder that I wasn't just going to meet with a lawyer. I was making the first move in a strategy that would change everything. And I'll admit, there was a strange calm in me, as if I had finally found my place on life's chessboard. When I arrived, Mr. Campbell was already waiting with the documents laid out neatly on his desk. He'd always been a meticulous man, the kind who never left a comma out of place. We sat face to face, and I spoke without hesitation. "I want to change the deed on the house, and I want to freeze access to the joint accounts." He looked up over his glasses, surprised at the firmness of my tone. But there was no hesitation in my words. For years I had swallowed ingratitude, endured betrayal disguised as indifference. But now, my silence was different, not passive, but strategic. It was the silence of a man preparing his revenge with elegance. As Mr. Campbell took notes, I thought about how life is like a card game. Sometimes we believe we've already lost the hand, but all it takes is turning over one hidden card to change the game completely. Those documents were my hidden card. Daniel had no idea that I still controlled the keys to the vault, the deed to the house, the financial limits of the very business he flaunted to impress others. He saw me as outdated, too old to understand numbers and contracts. Little did he know that every line signed was backed by years of effort and wisdom, and now that wisdom was returning to balance the scales. Then Mr. Campbell, in his calm voice, said something that shifted everything. "Edward, you can simply block and protect what's yours, but you could also go further. Have you thought about transferring part of the inheritance to someone who truly respects you? Your granddaughter, Olivia, for example." Those words echoed inside me. Olivia, so young, yet so different from her father. Whenever she visited, she showed genuine affection, real respect. She was never embarrassed to walk with me down the street or sit in my workshop listening to my stories about carpentry. Maybe she was the last living link that made me believe family values could survive time. The idea made instant sense, because revenge doesn't always mean destruction. It can mean building something new, transferring part of what I had to. Olivia wouldn't just be justice, it would be liberation. It would be like planting a seed in fresh soil, after realizing some roots had already rotted. I didn't just want to punish Daniel, I wanted him to clearly feel that respect is earned, and betrayal carries a price. Giving his daughter what he thought already belonged to him would be like holding up a mirror. And there's no deeper humiliation for an arrogant man than realizing the power he thought he owned now rested in other hands. As I signed the first papers, I noticed my hands didn't tremble anymore. On the contrary, they were steady, the same steady hands of a carpenter who knows exactly where to cut for the perfect fit. I was building again, not with wood, but with justice. And as I wrote my signature, I thought about how many others could learn from this. Not just parents, but anyone who's ever been betrayed. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate what's still in your hands. Sometimes, in the middle of humiliation, there are forgotten tools, silent keys capable of changing destinies. All it takes is courage to use them. I left the office quietly, walking like any ordinary man on a simple morning. No one would have guessed that behind those calm steps, a silent move had just been made. A move that would not only change my relationship with Daniel, but the entire future of the family. And that's the beauty of silence. It doesn't warn, doesn't threaten, doesn't announce. It simply acts. While the world stays distracted, silence prepares the turnaround. And I knew mine was already underway. The first block, the first transfer, the first act of reclaiming my dignity was complete. Deep down I smiled, not the wide smile of someone who's just won a prize, but the quiet smile of a man who knows a secret. Because soon Daniel would discover that the game had changed, and that the silent pawn he dismissed was still the true guardian of the board. I didn't need to raise my voice or justify myself. I only had to wait for the next move, because silence, when strategic, echoes louder than any shout. A few days passed after my visit to Mr. Campbell's office. I kept to my routine in silence, as if nothing had happened. I chopped wood in the backyard, stopped by the grocery store, sat in the square to chat idly with neighbors. On the outside, I was just Edward, the 66-year-old widower with slow steps and a worn hat. But inside, I knew the board had shifted. While Daniel believed he was in control, the ground was already shifting beneath his feet. And as it always happens with the arrogant, the first crack would appear when he least expected it. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind when the sun seems lazy. The phone rang insistently, and when I answered, I recognized Daniel's voice. But it wasn't the confident, commanding voice I was used to. It was nervous, shaky, laced with anger. "Dad, what's going on?" My card was declined. I was about to close on the new car, and they said the account is blocked. "What did you do?" For a moment, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. That was the confirmation I'd been waiting for. Proof that my silent move had worked. On the other end, it wasn't the self-assured son anymore. It was a man who, for the first time, felt the weight of consequence. I didn't respond right away. I let a few seconds of silence hang in the air between us. Because silence, at times like these, says more than 1,000 words. Have you ever noticed how silence unsettles the guilty? It exposes guilt, amplifies insecurity. Finally, I said, "Daniel, why don't you come by the house? I think we should talk in person." He was quiet for a moment, maybe expecting a quick explanation, a justification. But I didn't give him one. I stayed calm, holding the reins of the conversation. And as I hung up, I realized the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't the one waiting at the door. He was. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Power without violence. Dignity without shouting. It was as if I had just turned the key to destiny itself. How many fathers, after enduring betrayal and humiliation, never get to feel that turning point? And let me be clear, I wasn't talking about blind revenge. I was talking about justice. Justice born the moment a disrespectful son finally comes face to face with reality. It's like when someone mocks a father's simplicity, only to realize it was that very simplicity that built the foundation of everything they now have. The turnaround isn't only financial, it's moral. It's the shock of realizing the contempt was misplaced all along. As I waited for Daniel to arrive, I thought about all the times I had swallowed my pride just to avoid conflict. How many nights I'd gone to bed wondering if I had failed as a father, if somewhere in raising him I had gone wrong. But now, for the first time, I understood. It wasn't about failure. It was about choice. Daniel had chosen to humiliate me, and now he was tasting his own poison. That realization brought a strange sense of freedom. Because when you no longer need to beg for respect, something inside you heals. I didn't need to prove anything to him. He was the one who now had to face the weight of his own ingratitude. I remember looking at the table where I would place the documents. It felt like I was preparing a stage, not for a play, but for real life. Because life has those moments when it puts every character in their rightful place. And there I was, a simple man, yet firm, carrying the papers that would shift the entire balance of the family. Daniel, who had always cast me as a mere extra in his story, would be forced to see who was really behind the curtain pulling the strings. The reversal wouldn't be loud. It would be subtle, silent, and devastating. I could already picture his expression as he came in. The angry tone from his phone call had told me enough. He wasn't coming to talk. He was coming to demand. to confront, but I was ready. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to lose my temper, because when you have proof, when you have documents, when you have the truth on your side, silence becomes your greatest weapon. The other person's anger only reflects your serenity. And that was exactly what I wanted, for Daniel to feel, for the first time, that he was no longer facing the humble father who endured everything. He was facing the man who still held the keys to what he believed he already owned. And so, as I waited, I arranged the papers on the table, the house deed, the power of attorney, the recent changes signed at Mr. Campbell's office, everything ready, not for show, but to make it clear that betrayal and humiliation have a price, and this time, the price would be collected with interest. I knew that when Daniel walked through that door, he wouldn't find the father he had left standing in the cold. He would find the silent guardian, calm and patient, ready to show him that dignity is never lost. It simply transforms into strength. Daniel burst into the room like a storm. He didn't even greet me. He shoved the door open and went straight to the point. "Dad, what is this? The bank says I don't have access to the accounts anymore. My card's been declined. Have you lost your mind?" His voice was loud, filled with anger, but underneath I could hear fear. I stayed seated, my hands resting on the table. I didn't raise my tone. I didn't rush. I simply pointed to the chair across from me and said calmly, "Sit down." He hesitated for a moment, as if caught off guard by my firmness. And in that silence, I realized the power had already shifted. When he finally sat, I placed the documents on the table one by one. The house deed, the power of attorney, the recent changes, all signed and sealed. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. You still had all this?" I thought. I didn't let him finish. I cut him off with the calm of a man who has nothing left to prove. "You thought wrong." The words were simple but heavy, because truth doesn't need decoration. Sitting there before him wasn't the humiliated father he had left waiting on the porch. It was the man who had silently held together everything Daniel thought was already his. He tried to argue, but his words stumbled out broken. "But Dad, you don't understand. It was just one night." I shook my head. "No, Daniel, it wasn't just one night. It was years. Years of silence, of neglect, of humiliation you disguised as forgetfulness. That night you left me alone was only the breaking point. You thought I had no value anymore, but you forgot. I built every brick of this house, every dollar in those accounts, every opportunity you've ever had." With each word, I saw the color drain from his face. It wasn't shouting that silenced him. It was the weight of undeniable truth, backed by papers that didn't lie. For a few moments, the room was filled with absolute silence. Daniel lowered his eyes, fidgeting nervously, like a boy being scolded. I knew that moment would be a turning point. He wasn't just facing his father. He was facing the consequences of his own choices. That's when I added, firmly, "You left me waiting at the door, Daniel, but you didn't know I still had the key to everything." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Nothing else was needed. The dignity he had tried to strip from me was right there, untouched, shining in the weight of that sentence. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Dad, I just wanted," but there was no justification that could undo it. Respect, once broken, can't be rebuilt with rushed excuses. I simply closed the folder of documents and said, "I don't need to convince you of anything. Life is already showing you." I stood up slowly, walked over to the window, and turned my back on him. Because sometimes, turning your back is the strongest statement you can make. I no longer needed to face his anger or his excuses. The burden was already on him, and he knew there was no escape. When I turned back toward the table, Daniel was still sitting there, frozen. For the first time, he looked small, not in body but in spirit. His arrogance had melted into silence, and in that silence, I realized the confrontation was already won, because there is no greater victory than making someone see, without shouting, that they were wrong. The humiliation I had suffered at the door was now reversed, silently and completely, in my modest living room. And in that instant, I knew my revenge had served its purpose. Not revenge of destruction, but of revelation. I didn't need to break anything. I only needed to reveal who had truly held the keys all along. And Daniel, pale and speechless, was forced to face the reality he had long refused to admit. When Daniel left my house that night, silence remained. But it wasn't the heavy silence of humiliation anymore. It was something else. A lighter silence. The silence of someone who has finally put the pieces in place. I sat at the table, looked at the documents now tucked safely in the folder, and breathed deeply. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't slammed the table. I hadn't begged for respect. I had simply shown him that dignity is not negotiable, and betrayal always comes with a price. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. I made myself a simple cup of tea, sat down in the rocking chair, and watched the steam rise. Funny how the simplest things taste different when your heart is at peace. That tea wasn't just tea, it was a symbol of freedom. As I held the mug, I thought, Edward, you've won. Not against, Daniel, but against the pain he had left inside me. Because true revenge isn't about making the other person fall. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of humiliation. I looked around at the walls of my house and remembered every moment I had lived there. Daniel's laughter as a child, the smell of wood clinging to my clothes, the nights of exhaustion mixed with pride. Every brick carried a piece of my story, and knowing I still had power over all of it didn't make me feel superior. It made me feel whole. Because dignity isn't about defeating someone else. It's about not losing yourself. And that night, I knew I had reclaimed mine. I thought about Olivia, my granddaughter. I imagined her smile one day when she discovered what I had decided to leave her. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about property. It was about legacy, about showing her that respect and kindness will always be rewarded, even if it takes time. While Daniel rushed to impress the world, Olivia simply cared, and it was that simplicity I wanted to honor. As the rocking chair creaked gently, I realized there was no room left for bitterness. The resentment had given way to a deep serenity. Life had taught me that humiliation can be the seed of liberation, if you choose to transform it. Yes, I was left waiting at the door, but now I understand. That wait wasn't wasted time. It was the beginning of my turning point. I didn't need to punish with shouting or anger. My revenge had been silent, but firm. I had shown that I still held the key to everything. And most importantly, I showed myself that dignity doesn't disappear with age or rejection. It only needs to be remembered. And when it is, it brings a peace no amount of money can buy. That night, I closed my eyes with a quiet smile. Not because I had defeated my son, but because I had defeated myself, the part of me that once begged for respect. And I finally understood that the greatest liberation isn't about changing the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the pain they caused. And now I ask you, how many times have you felt pushed aside, as if you had no value within your own family? How many times have betrayal and humiliation come from the very people you sacrificed the most for? The truth is hard. Respect can't be begged for. It must be earned. And dignity isn't lost with age. It only needs to be remembered. If this story touched you, maybe it's time to look at your own life. Who's really in control of the game? Have you been settling for scraps of attention? Or are you living with the awareness that you still hold the keys in your hands? Think about that. Sometimes silence is the strongest revenge and the most powerful freedom. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever gone through something like this? Have you ever reached a moment when you had to prove through action the value someone tried to deny you? Share your story in the comments. Your experience could help others who are facing the same pain. And don't forget, if this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll always find stories that speak to the heart, spark reflection, and remind us of a truth that never changes. No one can take away your dignity.